Good afternoon. I am super excited to be here today. And today we're going to talk about the future of urban mobility and what this means for cities and the people who live in them, about how we can cut congestion, pollution, and reduce parking, as well as improve access to transportation by using private cars for public good. We believe this can be done using new technology and today's infrastructure. It's easy to demonize the car. There are over 1 billion of them in the world today, close to the populations of India and China. But the problem is not so much cars themselves, it's how they are used individually. Next time you're driving and at a stoplight, take a look to your left or your right. Chances are the car next to you has one person, the driver. When you drive alone, you're in good company. Of course, all of this individual car use comes at a significant public cost. In Los Angeles and Sydney, people spend 2 to 3 weeks a year stuck in traffic. In Asia's emerging megacities, such as Dhaka and Jakarta, it's much, much worse. That's less time with family, less time at work, and a whole lot of stress that nobody needs. What's more, congestion increases pollution. Today, 10% of all carbon dioxide emissions come from transportation. Sadly, that's just 5% of the problem, because cars sit idle 95% of the time. As a result, up to 1/5 of land in some cities is dedicated to housing these hunks of steel. Not homes or schools or parks, but parking spots and parking lots. In the US, there are more than 8 parking spots for every car. And in total, that covers an area 12 times the size of New York City. We asked an economic think tank to estimate the implied rental value of the 40,000 hectares or so of space used for parking in Indonesian cities. They came back to us with a figure of $7.2 billion US that could be released if that space was used for more productive purposes. Indeed, the opportunity cost to parking is tremendous, though it's not something we often count. It's space that could be otherwise used for bike lanes or more affordable housing. But today, in most cities, parking is encouraged, not discouraged. For new homes or offices, it's often part of the law that parking must be built, and it's usually not needed and definitely increases costs. That is the insanity of the way we build cities today. People are pushed into car ownership by design, urban design. Even in a city like Hong Kong, with great public transit, the subway doesn't get to everyone's front door. And the cost of building more transit stations is more than most governments in this region can bear. To be honest, this wasn't something our founders thought about when they invented Uber. They just thought it was pretty cool to push a button and get a ride. It was only once we got going, and ride-sharing in particular really took off, that we knew that today's transportation system was insufficient, inefficient, and unequal. The good news is there's an alternative to a world that looks like a parking lot and moves like a traffic jam. It's a world where more people share rides and use mass transit. The question is, how do cities get there? And of course, the answer is by providing affordable, reliable alternatives to individual car ownership, which really is the root of the problem. Let's start with reliability. In city after city around the world, Uber has proved that it can provide reliable transportation to every corner of the city, including parts that other transportation means don't recognize or don't reach. What you're seeing here is Jakarta and how Uber's reliable coverage area has expanded since our launch. Now what you see is consistently low average wait times, even in remote suburbs. Or Yangon, where Uber launched less than 2 months ago. Real-time dynamic pricing ensures that the supply of cars can meet the demand of passengers, even when it's raining or late at night. And in fact, on that note, in many cities, Uber's busiest periods happen to be late at night. This is when public transit is more limited and taxis are scarce. And it's definitely when a lot of people should not be behind the wheel, because this is when bars close. And this points to a nice side effect of ride-sharing in cities, a reduction in alcohol-related deaths from car accidents. In Australia, 42% of Uber users say that Uber has helped them personally avoid drinking and driving. In New South Wales, Uber is one of the government's Plan B partners, which means that we help provide rides home after large sporting events and participate in the government's efforts to educate individuals on how to get home safely late at night. So Uber has proved that we can reliably serve every corner of every city at all times of day. But what about affordability? This is crucial too, because people will only turn away from individual car ownership when they can get a car reliably and affordably. Now, policymakers have been talking about carpooling for years. It started in World War II, continued through the 1970s oil crisis, but the idea never really took off. And the reason for this is carpooling is really hard to get right, both for governments and private companies. Well, a few years ago, we were looking at our data, and what now seems obvious in retrospect was an interesting insight at the time, which was that we had many duplicate trips. That is, trips that sort of start in approximately the same part of a city and end in approximately the same part of a city, and are doing this at roughly or around the same time. And we started asking ourselves, can we use our technology and make our app match these rides so that you could make 2 or even 3 or 4 or 5 rides become 1 ride? And we knew that if we could do this, it would be good for all stakeholders. It would be good for passengers because the cost of a shared ride is certainly cheaper than the cost of an individual ride. It'd be good for drivers because it would mean more time with paying customers in the back of their seats, in the back of their cars. And it would be good for cities because we'd be putting more people into fewer cars. So the big question became, would folks share a ride with a stranger just to save a few bucks? And the answer was a resounding yes. Because at the end of the day, what mattered to people was convenience and cost, not the idea of sharing a ride with a stranger. And this has been huge for cities. What you see here is actually Manila, where people are choosing Uber Pool about 30% of the time. And on the left, you see what traffic would have looked like if people had taken their pool rides as separate trips. And on the right, you see what it actually looked like with Uber Pool. And the benefit for cities is enormous here. Where we have Uber Pool, it accounts for about 20% of our trips. And this is having a huge impact on the world. In the first 3 months of 2017 alone, by pooling trips, we've saved over 100 million kilometers of driving distance. That accounted for 4.9 million liters of gas saved and over 11,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide that wasn't spewed into the environment. So, what's next? Where do we go from here? Well, I'll tell you, it's very important that we launched our shared ride service before we put self-driving cars on the road. And the reason for that is that self-driving vehicles, we believe, will only reach their full potential in a shared rides environment. And what I mean by that is, if all self-driving cars do is currently replace individual car ownership today at the same rate, then we're just cementing current congestion problems. So we actually need to get people used to leaving their cars at home sooner rather than later, or frankly not buying a car at all. And given that self-driving cars are going to be pretty darn expensive for some time, spreading the cost of self-driving cars over a shared network will actually help speed technology adoption. Of course, the success of self-driving cars is going to depend on this technology evolution, obviously. And they still have a long way to go. They still have trouble with unexpected events like accidents or poor weather. And the reality is that in all but the most controlled circumstances, a safety driver is needed. But we're getting there. And what is actually going to prove to be more important in the long term, I believe, is the approach of government. If you look at the attitudes towards ride-sharing today, globally and in this region, you'll see a range of reactions. Many have welcomed these services with open arms. Here in Asia, we're seeing positive momentum, with formal ride-sharing regulations or drafting processes underway in China, India, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. But others have been more reticent, either because they haven't internalized the potential of this technology, or because it's an attempt to salvage the status quo. But either way, the result is the same. That's limited mobility options for citizens. A recent study by the International Transport Forum of the OECD suggested that self-driving vehicles, as part of a shared service, could cut cars on the road by over 90%. And with that impact, our world would be unrecognizable. So much of the stress and cost would be removed from city life. Places that embrace ride-sharing now will have a natural advantage when it comes to self-driving. By helping break the link with individual car ownership, we actually help increase the use of all shared mobility options, not just Uber or other ride-sharing services. In fact, this is already something we're seeing organically from our user base. In Chicago, for instance, more than 25% of Uber trips are one-way trips, meaning there isn't a corresponding trip out of that location within 24 hours. And we're starting to see interesting statistics emerge, one from the Singapore Land Transport Authority, which said that actual car ownership in Singapore last year declined by 4%. Now, of course, there could be a variety of factors that go into that, but that's super interesting data. And we're actually seeing attitudes of consumers, which frankly will drive this the most, change. So of people who gave up their car last year in the United States, 9% of them, and this is survey data from a Reuters Ipsos survey, said that they were giving up their car to focus on using ride-sharing services like Uber or Lyft exclusively. This is a super interesting trend. Think about if you have a child or a niece or nephew under 10 years old today. What's the likelihood that when they turn 18, they're going to run out the door to get their car license? I think it's a pretty limited number of folks that are going to do that at this point. And so while the trends we've observed are promising and Uber feels good about our role in this, we can't do it alone. To fundamentally shift the attitude towards individual car ownership, we'll have to work closely with other shared mobility providers to tackle this trend together. And we're optimistic about our willingness to do this and the willingness of partners. Because one report in 2016, there was a report by the American Public Transport Association, which found that the more people use ride-sharing services like Uber, the more likely they are to use public transit. And also, that people that use a combination of public transit and Uber or Lyft or whatever were more likely to give up car ownership. So by literally picking up where public transportation drops off, Uber helps give people the benefits of car ownership without the hassle and expense. So for example, if your train or subway or bus doesn't get you all the way home, Uber will take you that last mile. By complementing existing mass transit systems, we're able to extend their reach at no extra cost to the taxpayer. This is Singapore, a city with one of the best public transit systems in the world. But even here, city buses and trains can't reach every single doorstep. We want to help usher in a future of transportation, a reinvented future of transportation driven by shared rides. That's why we're working with transportation agencies around the world to help them solve some of their toughest challenges. A few regional examples. In Hyderabad, India, we've signed an MOU with the government there for the use of Uber Moto. Moto's a great first mile, last mile product because it can move through the cities with speed, to pick up from their soon-to-be-built public transit system. Also in India, just last week in the southern city of Chennai, we signed a similar tie-up to pick up and drop off at 12 metro stations. So we're making progress working with governments on this. In our vision of the future, people share rides and take public transit because it's a better option to owning a car. In this future, people have equal access to affordable transportation. They spend less of their income on cars and commutes and less time stuck behind the wheel. And parking spaces are replaced by parks and affordable housing. And this future is within our grasp. In fact, we're seeing examples of this emerge already with investment decisions pursuing this future. In Los Angeles, for example, real estate developers recently have begun a new trend, which is building new apartment buildings with a shared future in mind. And this means designing parking spaces which can be easily converted into storefronts, recreational space, or even a movie theater. This is our ultimate hope, that we can turn every journey into a shared journey by using a combination of ride-sharing and mass transit. And that people will use these services not through coercion, but through choice. Because sharing will be cheaper and more convenient to individual car ownership. Mass urbanization is one of the defining trends of our generation. There's so much that is great about living in a city already. And by embracing shared modes of transportation, we can make cities less congested and polluted, with more space for people and parks, and where everyone, wherever they live, and whatever their income, can have access to affordable, reliable transportation. Thank you very much.